Well, hello and welcome to SBI Growth's Value Creation Podcast. I'm Ray Mackler. I'll be moderating and looking forward to a fantastic discussion today with two industry leaders in the video and role play space, Adam Clay and Dr. Stefanie Boyer. And so we're going to be diving into this topic and I think covering it from a couple of different angles that are unique and, hopefully offering some different perspective on how this is evolving, because I know we're all really intrigued and moving quickly and trying to keep up with what's going on, and they're leading the industry in that space. So, Adam, Dr. Boyer, welcome. And do you mind just starting? And Adam, maybe you could just introduce yourself and just say a little bit about your role.
I'd be happy to. And Ray, thank you so much for having us today. We're delighted to be here. So I've been 25 years in sales, with the majority of it leading global sales organizations for about a half a dozen companies. And over the course of my time in the industry, I just developed a significant passion for sales conversations, what makes them effective, what makes them ineffective, how we make them valuable and beneficial for the prospects and customers that we're speaking to. And I had the distinct pleasure to last year, meet Dr. Boyer, who had been researching how salespeople learn over the last couple of decades. And together with our co-founder, we realized that there was a significant market opportunity to help salespeople master the conversations of their company's design through rigorous and relevant practice. And for that reason, we launched Rainmakers Inc. last year to provide scalable and automated role play to sales organizations around the world.
That's fantastic. And yeah, Dr. Boyer, a pleasure to have you as well. And I know you've been working in and around this space for years, and so really intrigued to hear some of your insights. But do you mind introducing yourself to our audience?
Thank you again for having us. And yes, I've been researching how sellers learn for over 20 years now, and just understanding what drives them, what motivates them, what helps them to be better performers. And I am the co-founder and chief science officer and head of education at Rainmakers. And so I'm helping to ensure that our products are infused with the science of learning.
All right. Well, no, thanks for those introductions. And, one of the things that's really interesting is we are seeing selling getting more challenging these days. It's not just the sellers telling us that, right? But some of the research we've done says, yes, in fact, not only are there more stakeholders involved, but it's a more diverse buying group. There are transient buyers that come in and out and sometimes swoop back in at the end and disrupt deals. And it makes it more buying friction in general. And it means that our sellers need to be even better, right, with how they approach their target markets and their customers. Yet, with all the investment in sales training, it seems like there's still a lot of room for opportunity there. So, Adam, maybe you could start there. Can you talk a little bit about how, you help to address that challenge and, some of the things you're seeing with how we close that gap or how we improve the skills of our sellers?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, Stefanie and I at Rainmakers have the opportunity to, on an almost daily basis, where I speak with sales leaders and heads of sales enablement from companies of all sizes around the world. And what's remarkable to us is that what they say they're struggling with is profoundly consistent from one organization to the next. And it can be summed up in two ways. The first is that they have a conversation designed that they would like their salespeople to have. And generally, they would like their sellers to ask more questions, talk less, listen more attentively as a way of driving opportunity forward. That's the first thing. The second thing is they're unsure about how to improve conversational skill and behavior and outcomes that are predicated on having effective sales conversations. And they often, lament the fact that their sales managers and sales coaches are really preoccupied with running the business, with trying to move deals forward, and they run out of time in the day to coach to the conversation. And Stefanie and I find that to be a remarkable irony in the sales profession, that so much is predicated on the sales conversation, yet as a unit of productivity, something to improve, not only is it difficult to do, but it's often overlooked as a consequence of being difficult to improve. And, Stefanie, I think, has hit upon, real nuggets of wisdom and insight through her research about how salespeople learn and why so much of what we teach sellers about the conversation was never going to stick anyway, because of the method and the manner in which these conversations get taught.
Yeah, well, Dr. Boyer, maybe you could dive into that in a little more detail, because I know we see that, and oftentimes, and we hear from customers that they have engaged in training in the past, and it feels like they're drinking from a fire hose, and they get the 2 days and a really nice workbook, and then they go back and they're like, what now, right? How do I apply this, or what do I do next? So, what have you found and learned over the years in terms of, how we get past that, or some of the things that we can use to address that?
Sure. And what you were just hitting on is the challenge of reinforcement, right? That the sales kickoff, the annual training, everyone comes in, and it's really more about motivation, but that motivation it tapers off after the week. And most of the things that they learned throughout the week, 90% of them are probably forgotten before they even get home. So it is a challenge, but I would say really even looking before they go home, looking at how they're trained, because salespeople, they learn a little bit differently, and the way that we're training them does not align with the way that sellers and with adults, the way that they learn effectively. And so the way that we're designing those really needs to be addressed. And so just for an example, traditional training methods are typically what organizations are using to train their sellers. And this happens to also be the way that we train our own children. And children do not learn the way that adults learn. And so this is a very structured approach. The materials, the content, the evaluation, all of it is decided by someone else. It's mandatory. And sellers, really, to thrive, they need to have a little bit more locus of control over their learning, and especially as their contextual understanding increases. So their experience, they know how to sell, they know the product, they know the industry, they're understanding the customer. They need even more autonomy to be able to direct some of their own learning. So they need a little bit of a choice. So when you bring your entire sales team in and everyone is in the same room listening to that same speaker that one time, first of all, they're not going to remember most of that. But that isn't how people learn effectively. So they might hear information, but there's a very big gap and a bridge that has to be built between I've just heard something and I think I might understand it, but to the application of that. So if you want your sellers to be able to do things, which is why we're training them, because we want them to behave a certain way, act a certain way, then we have to give them the opportunity to practice that, to bridge that gap. Otherwise, they're going to bridge it when they're with the customer, and it's going to be very sloppy.
And it's a very expensive way to do training, right? Is training on your customers. We don't have enough of those at bats, and if we're using that to kind of fumble our way through and figure it out by trial and error, it's expensive and it takes a long time. But you hit on a really interesting point. When we think about maybe we want to provide the same foundation. We want them to speak the same language, follow a certain sales process, but then we need to meet them where they are in terms of the training and the reinforcement going forward, so that they don't feel like it's either below them or, frankly, above them, like they're not ready for that level. Can either of you talk about how AI is helping to address that challenge, and how do we bridge that gap of meeting the learner where they are, and also giving them something they can take with them after the training, right, to continue to reinforce those skills?
Yeah, I'd be happy to start, but I'll defer very quickly here to Dr. Boyer, because she's the source of Rainmaker's wisdom on this topic. But yeah, having spent more than 2 decades working closely with salespeople, teaching them how to have what I believed to be more effective conversations, if my first introduction to Stefanie proved anything, it was that all of my thinking was absolutely wrong and backwards. And so what I learned, and it makes perfect sense, and I think this might resonate with those listening, Ray, is that salespeople need pretty wide berth to learn if they're going to practice a new skill. And we think that practicing conversations, through role play is a wonderful way to master conversations. It's just the way that role play is done, typically with your boss a few times a year. We think that's flawed. But if you're going to practice, with a platform like Rainmakers, using intelligent AI bots to have conversations, best to do that for your salespeople in a way that affords them wide berth for trial and error. And what Dr. Boyer has taught me about psychological safety, creating a place where people can feel free to make plenty of mistakes. And as a sales leader, reflecting on my own career before I joined Rainmakers, I never created that, nor did I give the volume of practice required to actually master the conversation. But let me pass it over to Dr. Boyer, because she's got a lot of knowledge on this point.
Thank you. And what we've learned from analyzing about 750,000 role play conversations is that it takes about 30 conversations to really see a significant step change in performance. So a seller is practicing a role play, and instantly, like within the first 5 conversations, they are getting about 15% better. But over the next several conversations, they're kind of bumping around. There is trial and error. They're not really getting that much better, getting that much worse. But then when they hit about 30 conversations, they see a significant improvement in their performance. And so they might see like an 80% improvement of their performance at that point. And then they have to continue on. And it takes about 40 to 50 conversations to really practice that. And I think that's where AI can help to be able to give the kind of consistent practice that's needed. But I think, sometimes we think, well, we just need to make sure people get more practice, but not all practice is created equal. So I think you hit on this a little bit before, Adam, where you're saying, sales managers can't necessarily put the time in. They don't necessarily know how the customer is speaking. They can't be as prepared as they would like. Sometimes they just don't have the time. It's not prioritized. And so when the sales manager may do a role play once a week with a seller, they're not getting enough repetitions in order to solidify some of those skills. And there could just be inconsistencies. So the manager may not know how to give the right kind of feedback, or, they could be just creating and reinforcing bad habits with their sellers. You also see this when sellers practice with each other, and they don't know how to give each other feedback as well. So more practice isn't always the answer. And that's what we call the practice paradox. It's really having meaningful, qualified feedback with good quality practice as well in order to get the 30 repetitions. And even if you had an amazing sales manager, they wouldn't be able to do that many repetitions. They're probably going to go down a variety of different rabbit holes in the conversation. So they're not really solidifying some of those skills and abilities.
No, I think it's so important.
Go ahead. Sorry. I was going to say, just to put a bow, for those that are newer to these concepts, as I once was, around what Dr. Boyer just said, if you buy into the notion that in order to master a conversation, you have to perform it 30 to 50 times, and we agree that it's a bad thing to practice in front of customers. Therefore, you need an effective way to practice, and practicing with your manager for reasons that Stefanie just describe is not the most effective thing, then we would argue that, a high-tech platform that makes wide use of AI is the only way that you're going to inspire practice and authentic conversations. And so we're just lucky to be here at a moment where the technology is available to allow sales reps the opportunity to do this.
Yeah, and I think it is a really exciting area that's just exploding, right? Evolving very rapidly, and I think it does, helping to address that challenge. And Dr. Boyer, I think you were generous when you said the manager's practicing once a week. I think it's a rare organization that we see that's really doing that. And you just said it's really hard to scale the consistency across a global sales organization to get the kind of practice and reinforcement. And we see it in every one of our workshops where we may have a very detailed simulation or role play scenario, but getting the person to play the customer, right, in a meaningful way is challenging. And, people, they aren't necessarily actors, probably aren't actors, and don't play that role or may take their own bias into that role play. So it's really difficult to get that consistency. So I'm familiar with your platform and really intrigued with the ability to tailor and speak to specific personas. But maybe for our audience, can you just give us a high level? We won't turn it into a commercial, but just a high level.
Yeah.
How do we address that, and why is AI so empowering to help to close that gap?
Yeah, I'd be happy to give a brief overview. So, as Stefanie mentioned, not all practice is the same. And if you're going to ask a salesperson to practice with significant intentionality for the purpose of building up skill, perhaps modifying, conversational behavior to learn in the right increments, the right way to handle the conversation, then the experience has to be really good, Ray.
Mm.
And so at Rainmakers, we think about two types of training exercise. There's the training exercise that's going to feel like compliance to the seller. We think that's bad. And then there's the type of training that's going to feel fun and engaging. And that's the experience that we try to create in Rainmakers. But to be relevant to a sales rep, and I'll defer here to Dr. Boyer in a moment, because again, I've learned so much from her in the last year. Sellers are very sensitive to realism in training. And when you talk about simulating customer conversations like we do at Rainmakers, we provide the ability to have a sophisticated sales conversation with a buyer of our customer's design, against the conversational design that they're trying to help their salespeople master. In order to make that a rewarding experience, we have to create a lot of realism. The buyer has to sound like a real customer. They have to emote like a real customer. They have to have a backstory like a real customer. And the meeting's got to take place in a setting that's recognizable. And the voice has to be good. It has to be free from distraction. And the UI has to be compelling, not threatening, and not distracting. And at the same time, if you're going to have a conversation with a customer, as sure as I'm talking to you right now, but you're going to be doing it on your phone or on your PC like we do at Rainmakers, then I'd better know what's expected of me. Like, what do I need to be demonstrating in the conversation? What do I need to be practicing, rather, in the conversation in order to feel like I'm improving? And so we take all of that to heart, and we wrap the entire experience at Rainmakers in the language of game mechanics. So one of our co-founders, Scott Randall, award-winning game and simulation designer, has figured out a way to use, along with his team, adaptive game mechanics to make the practice of conversations fun and engaging and progressively challenging as learners come into the platform for the first time and as they exit having demonstrated mastery over the conversation. But I want to give it back to Stefanie, because what she's discovered in her research about the role that relevance and realism play in inspiring sellers toward repetitious practice is pretty remarkable, because it turns out that they're profoundly sensitive to stuff that's going to waste their time. Uh,
It,
Putting Rainmakers aside,
Right.
this is a nugget that when I first learned it, I thought would apply to anybody seeking to train salespeople. So, Steph, I'll give it to you.
Well, and just before you do that, Dr. Boyer, I just wanted to jump in because I think it's so important to point out video role play has been around for a while, right? I mean, that's not new. And in fact, it has, there are ways that you can practice and the manager could go in and score it, or, you could upload it and share it with your peers. But it felt more like compliance, right? And the biggest challenge there was adoption, was getting people to do it because it felt like something that was being done to them. And then they may or may not even get good feedback. It was just, hey, record your 5 videos this week and upload them. So anyway, I'd like to work that into the conversation because I think your idea of making it fun, engaging, gamifying it is so important. So with that, Dr. Boyer, maybe you could expand on what Adam was.
Actually, Ray, let me just touch on that for a moment. And I'm sorry to just interject myself here, but you mentioned something really interesting, and it ties to your opening question about how the conversation has evolved. That notion of uploading videos of myself having a sales conversation, that ties to what we think is old school selling behavior, which is far too prevalent in the market.
100%.
That's what you're going to be able to do when you upload a video of yourself is record yourself pitching your product. You're going to record yourself talking. And we think sales skills are largely based on really good questions, very thoughtful listening, and appropriate amounts of information, dished out when the customer needs them. Does that make sense? You can only do that in a two-way conversational interaction. Recording videos doesn't inspire skill development in a direction that we think mirrors what buyers want today. But Steph, go ahead.
It's funny. I was thinking, who are you sending this video in with? Is it with another seller where you're practicing? Is it with a customer where it's already too late and the mistakes have been made? And of course, if you submit your role play, your conversation, and it takes a couple days, a week or more, or maybe you never get feedback, then you feel like it's just not a good use of your time. It's just not something that, is valuable. So I think we're still recording, right?
We're still recording. I think you can keep answering the question.
Okay, guys. So Adam, you're right now. So getting back to what makes sellers want to come back for more, thinking about being in a real world setting. So sellers need to feel that the training, the time that they're spending away from their customers, away from all the administrative tasks that they have to do, it has to be worthwhile. It has to be a very good use of their time when they're training. Otherwise, they just feel like it's a waste of their time and it's attacking their competence to do something that isn't really going to help them or move the needle forward. So definitely making sure that you're meeting the sellers where they are is really valuable too. When a salesperson comes in and the training is really difficult, it's above their ability, their head, then they're going to feel like it's impossible. They can't really accomplish a task. They're set up for failure. So they're discouraged and they don't want to continue to practice. And as well, if the seller comes in and the training is too easy, the conversations are too easy, it's things that they already know, again, that attack on their competence is felt and they're frustrated. They don't want to do the practice, and they're certainly not going to do 30 conversations to practice either.
Yeah, absolutely. And, can you speak a little bit to then if we get that right, we engage them, they see it as something that, I don't know, fun, but at least that they're willing to do. And we know that they're going to probably practice more than they might otherwise. What kind of benefits are you seeing? And, how do you measure whether or not that's working? Because that's really the question all the customers are asking, right? Is this going to make a difference? And what's the outcome that we can expect from this?
Sure. And that practice, it moves from this compulsory, mandatory thing that is being done to me to an opportunity to improve and get better and have more confidence and be more motivated. So that when your sellers are practicing 30, 40, 50 or more times to make sure they're prepared for the conversation, then they're going to show up to the conversation and they're going to do what it is that you've trained them to do. You can count on that. because they practice it so much. They've almost built a muscle memory around the conversations, how to have empathy and to be present. So no longer are they thinking about, oh my gosh, what am I supposed to be saying? Did I get this right? Did I remember this? Instead, they're just executing.
Yeah. And we know, I mean, there's a lot of research supporting it. If the behaviors change, we'll get the results. So, better skills equals better results, and there's a strong correlation. But how do we get those better skills? And it sounds like through repetition. Adam, were you going to add something to that?
Well, if it's helpful, just to add to Dr. Boyer's insight, when I think about how the companies we work with justify an investment in a practice platform like Rainmakers, they're doing it largely to reflect what we believe the value in this type of practice is, which is dramatically reduced ramp-up time for salespeople, first and foremost. The average ramp-up time, if you read the research for a sales rep, hangs between 9 and 18 months, depending upon the complexity of the sale. And we believe that we can shrink that down to weeks or months as it pertains to conversational proficiency. Number one. Number two, better skill, better behavior in a sales conversation just accrues to a much more delightful experience for the prospect. The likelihood that you'll convert that conversation to a next step also goes up dramatically. And Ray, I'm preaching to the choir here because you've built a very successful business around that fact. It's predicated on the notion that people actually put these skills and behaviors into use. And so we offer a way to do it that's reflective of the way that Dr. Boyer described. And we think the uplift in conversion rate from point of conversation to the next step in the sales process also goes up dramatically. And if that's done really well, then you're looking at larger deals that convert at higher prices, that convert more predictably at a higher win rate. That's how we think about the impact that we can have. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, and that's such a huge ROI to get that right. And even the ramp up, which you mentioned, it's not just, we want them to be productive as soon as possible, but if we can get them to their quota carrying target sooner, that means they are producing that much sooner on target. So and you all have probably seen the numbers, but you can do the math and figure out, well, if we can shorten that ramp up time, not only are we saving ramp up time, but we're actually getting to quota sooner and we're producing more revenue for the organization. And that's significant. A couple other areas I wanted to explore. Go ahead. Yeah, please.
Sorry, Ray. I was going to say, in addition to that, when your team is trained, when your team is confident and they know they're going to do well, then we also see from the research that turnover decreases, commitment increases. So generally, the sales team is more motivated, they're happier, the morale is higher, and they're loyal. They stay because they know that they are prepared and they're going to be successful. So it goes beyond just fast ramp and performance and higher performance. It also leads to that higher commitment.
Yeah, and there's another huge business driver. If we have to replace that rep because they washed out or they got demotivated and they left, the cost of that, while you have to recruit and fill and ramp them up and get to quota, again, is many, many multiple times, the actual cost of that particular sales professional. So yeah, another driver. I was going to say, we spend a lot of time, helping empower and enable frontline sales managers, to be better leaders and coaches. And so you talked about maybe old school was the manager, if they're good, is spending time role playing, with their individuals, they're practicing, they're giving them feedback. How does this help the frontline manager? Because they're underwater, they're challenged, they have one of the most difficult jobs in the organization. But how can this empower the manager to scale their team and improve their performance?
Yeah, thank you for circling back on that point, because that is the second big one that we hear from the market. And so there's a couple of ways that we do it at Rainmakers, which we think is unique. So the first is, all of the coaching feedback that we give to a sales rep who is performing, repetitious role plays on our platform, it's all customizable by the customer. And we think that's so important, Ray, because customers know where they want to place the emphasis on the coaching and the feedback that you get in the platform. And so we provide feedback in a few different ways. The first is in the role play while you're playing. This comes down to the use of game mechanics as you're learning to have a conversation, as you're going through your first 5, 10, 15 repetitions. And until you score to a certain level, we're going to be forward with feedback if this is what our customer wants. Like, hey, Ray, this might be a good time to ask that question. Why don't you give it a shot, right? Like, hey, Ray, like, probably a good time to stop pitching your product and start inquiring about the business impact. And so that's one way to provide feedback. The second is after the role play, and Stefanie mentioned this earlier, we try to provide very specific and detailed feedback immediately to the seller in a way that's useful, because our whole reason for existence is to inspire the seller to play again. And what Stefanie will tell you is that salespeople crave really good, relevant feedback, and they want to get back in there and demonstrate their ability to apply it. Does that make sense? Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that we're here to replace, the armies of sales managers and sales coaches that exist. To the contrary, we're here to help the reps perform better, but also give them insight into, whether Adam is practicing the conversation, right? If I'm improving through my use of rainmakers, and where I might be getting stuck, and then give the manager a very precise understanding of where I'm struggling in my mastery of the conversation. I really need some help in closing for next steps. I really need help in quantifying, the implications of doing something or not doing something. And that, we think, is an opportunity in the hands of a manager to provide not what they give today, which is sort of general, questionably useful feedback, but pinpointed feedback. And we would even encourage, Ray, that armed with that insight into where I as a seller am struggling, go ahead and role play it manually. Like, that's something you can work on in a way that's quite pinpointed to help me get over the hump where the Rainmakers data suggests I'm clearly struggling. Does that make sense?
Well, yes, and it hits on a theme that we're looking at, across other applications as well, which is how do we give the managers the insights they need to really coach and to coach at scale versus having to feel like they have to ride along on every sales call, right? Or we say, hey, if you have to jump in and ride to the rescue, what's happening when you're not there? Well, now we can see that because it's aggregating and it's giving us some insights about that particular rep or sales professional and where we might want to focus our coaching for maximum impact. And I think that's really exciting. The other thing, you mentioned the customization area, and I wanted to dive into because I was really intrigued with the idea of not just, feeding it a scenario, but really training it on the business and on the personas and, all the aspects so that it knows the different iterations. And I think AI is now taken that to a level that we couldn't have imagined previously. Can you speak a little bit about how you address that and, how that comes out in the scenarios?
Yeah. So, we have a very sophisticated platform that, creates a buyer persona using, what might be, seen as a limited amount of data from our customers. For example, we want to know, what's the personality of the buyer, their backstory, their disposition, their tone, their resistance to discovery, for example, what the setting of the meeting is. And part of the power of our platform is we can take, some indicators of what your customer might actually need to be like in the context of the role play. And then our platform extrapolates a fairly robust, automated bot that's going to reflect the customer you need your sellers to practice against. And so that's what we do. And it's interesting because we built role plays for the pharmaceutical industry, for example, where the role of the salesperson is to get a doctor to consider switching medications that they've been married to for a decade or more. And the setting of the role play is, as it often is, in a cafeteria in a hospital. And the doctor wants nothing to do with you, right? And so that role play will make you sweat. We have other role plays where, the executive has a burning problem and they came in through an inbound lead. And, what our customer wanted to create in that role play was a skill associated with asking many diagnostic questions before they pitch. Because Ray, if you came to me, you're a screaming inbound lead for my platform, I might just want to tell you how great we are and how we're going to help you, right?
Absolutely.
But this particular role play cultivates that skill. It's very different from the doctor in the cafeteria because the executive in this second role play has very low discovery resistance. There's so much pain that they're going to pretty much tell you anything you want to know about their situation so that they can understand whether or not they can be helped. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Well, look, I want to be sensitive to our time, but I just wanted to wrap up with a question for both of you. And Dr. Boyer, I know you've looked at this area for years and watched it evolve, but what are you excited about, as AI and the language models evolve and we're leveraging these more in these types of applications, what are you keeping your eye on and what are you excited about in terms of how things are progressing from here?
I'm just really excited that now we can infuse products with the science of learning. So for 20 plus years, I've been researching and publishing articles on effective sales training and learning and methods. And it's not really digestible for the typical sales leader or sales manager talking about a nomological network or looking at my hierarchical linear model, this complex modeling. But now we can do this, right? The training, the technology, it's all coming together at the right time with the right team here, of course, to be able to make this move and to help. And, with this huge movement towards AI, I think that companies are becoming more and more open to using it as a training tool and seeing the value that it's really going to move the needle for sales training.
That's really exciting for the future. And Adam, anything you'd add there and any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I couldn't add much to what Stefanie just said. I think she's right on target. I'm equally passionate about the possibility that technology presents now to help sales reps meet buyers where they are and have the types of conversations that are actually going to move the needle. Yeah.
Well, I think that's really promising and also a great place maybe to wrap up, for all of us is helping to empower sales professionals, improve the productivity and, finally get that promise of, helping to improve their skills and their performance. And at the end of the day, make them more productive, which is really exciting. So really appreciate both of you for your time today and sharing your insights with us. And look forward to, continuing these discussions as they evolve, and best of luck to both of you and to Rainmakers in the future. Thank you.